you're not the note-taking kind, you can go onto our website right now, and this PowerPoint and the notes are on it, free to download. I am attempting to record an audio version and a video version. We'll see how that goes because I'm notoriously unlucky with tech. So if either of those become viable, they will be up there as well. It's hilltophowlers.org. I guess I could tell y'all a bit about us. We are a community group that's kind of new to the city. We started in March, and we support art, culture, music, small business. And this is our first workshop that we're doing. The intention is the lab wants us to do this. They said quarterly. We'll see how demand goes. Probably every 6 months. But when I'm done speaking, don't feel like you have to rush off. The idea is the first half is class, and the next half is networking, so that, maybe people will come up with cross-promotion ideas, things like that. You can see all about us at hilltophowlers.org. And we're on Instagram is where we do most of our social media. It's where we have the best results, and that's the Hilltop Howlers. And we currently are doing a monthly literary night at the Sanctuary, where book clubs and writing groups can get together and do what they do. And starting next month, we are doing a monthly fiber arts gathering through the library system. And we got a bunch of other stuff in the works, but for now, let's talk podcasting. Okay. I assume you're all here because you want to start a podcast. Have you? So I assume none of y'all have ever done any podcasting before. Y'all listen to podcasts, though? Okay. So what is a podcast? Very simply, it's just a series of episodic digital audio files. The episodic is kind of the key thing there. The idea is that it is an ongoing series broken down in episodes. Otherwise, you're in other forms of media. So, step one, you need to get an idea. That's the hardest part, really, coming up with a good, unique idea. Because whatever your idea is, your first step should be to go look to see if someone else has done it. And odds are they have. Don't let that stop you, though. There are thousands of podcasts talking about movies. Doesn't mean you can't make a podcast about movies. Maybe you have a unique spin on it. Maybe you just have better audio production values. Maybe you have more interesting guests. Maybe you have something that sets you apart. So don't let the fact that someone else has done your idea stop you. But just bear in mind that if your podcast is just three guys in a room talking about their lives, not a lot of people are going to listen to that. That's been done. So the first bit of advice I have is you should figure out who your audience is. Like, figure out your idea and figure out who you're trying to reach. And a tip that I stumbled upon while I was prepping for this, which I wish I had stumbled upon when I was starting my podcast, is to create a sample persona. Basically, think of who your market is and invent just a person that you imagine that's in that audience. Give them a name. And just anytime you're thinking about making changes or coming up with ideas for your podcast, just think, what would Jim think about this? It helps you kind of humanize and think more in those terms. And you should think, why should they listen to you? Out of all the people that are doing this type of podcast, or if you're lucky enough to have the one podcast of its type, why should they listen to you? What are you bringing to the table? And if you can't really answer that, maybe rework your idea, maybe work to develop strategies that will give them reasons why they should listen to you. You should figure out where they are. Where are your listeners? And that doesn't mean like physically. I mean, to a degree it can. It can mean, or do you think the majority of your listeners are going to be listening in their car? Or are they going to be listening at work, at home? That can help. But really it's where do they hang out, specifically online? Where are they? So to tell you briefly about my podcasting experience, I've done 3 podcasts. My biggest is Books, Beards, and Booze. It's a literary podcast. We've done over 170 episodes. We're actually about to wrap it up. But so for that, we knew that we were talking about fantasy books. Well, there's a lot of people who read fantasy books on Reddit in the fantasy subreddit. So going there, engaging with people, that helped us find some of our audience. We knew that they were there. The other thing is going to come down to marketing. When you start to market this, where are the people that listen to your type of podcast hanging out? For example, with the Howlers, our social media, we have far better results on Instagram than anywhere else. But the kind of people that we're trying to reach tend to skew younger people on Instagram. We have very little interaction on Facebook because a lot of the things that we do aren't as interesting to older people, and that they primarily are on Facebook. So if your target market are people 35 plus, maybe Facebook's a better option for you. 35 and younger, maybe Instagram's a better option. Maybe neither. Maybe your target market's on Twitter. These are things you got to figure out. If you already have an audience, for example, maybe it's growing increasingly common that businesses are starting podcasts. So maybe your business already has a following. Use that. These are the perfect people. They're already interested in your business, or maybe you do crafts and you're wanting to do a podcast and you have a successful Instagram or YouTube channel. Then maybe you ask them, like, well, what are you looking for? Like if I'm thinking about starting a podcast, what kind of things do you want on it? And that'll really help you hone in on what's going to work best for you. And at any time, if you have questions, please shout them out. I don't mind interruptions. Yes?
What if do you always have to have a target audience that is one particular age group? Or can you have a more general target?
It can. Yeah, you could, because a lot of podcasts are based around interests. They're not, obviously if you're doing a podcast on aging, then yeah, it's more age specific. But if you're doing a podcast on movies have a broad appeal. So yeah, you just find but it still applies. Find where the people who are interested in movies, like what are the movies that you're going to be talking about? Okay, we're talking about we're talking about horror movies. Well, I just know I don't actually, but hypothetically, I know I like horror movies, and so I hang out on these forums. Well, I know that there's a lot of people on those forums, and I know that just from my experience as a person with this interest, that most people talking about horror movies are in this space or this space. So that's really finding your market. It doesn't have to be age-based. It's typically going to be interest-based. But interests do frequently have kind of age ranges that are into it, or income brackets. If your hobby is Warhammer is an expensive hobby. So you're going to want to be in spaces where they're operating that maybe aren't in other spaces. So you might be trying to target by more like income-based type things. I don't have a lot of experience with that because I'm poor. So step 2 is you need to figure out what your goal for podcasting is. Is this just a hobby? Is this for a brand? Are you trying to make money? You're not going to make money. It's very, very unlikely that you're going to make any money doing this. You can, but if you're thinking this is going to be your next career, you have much better odds picking a number of other side hustles to be your next career. The market is, 10 years ago, much more likely. At this point, the market is glutted. So you just got to think, what am I trying to do here? And manage your expectations. For example, when I was doing, we started Books, Beards, Booze because I'm a writer, and I like to drink, and I have a beard. And my co-host also was bearded, liked to drink, and loved books. And so for us, it was partly an excuse just to hang out. We would get together, talk about this, but at the same time, I'm a writer. I viewed this as backdoor marketing to my books. The thought was, I'm writing books in this genre. People come on here, they like my persona, and maybe they check out my books. But at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily to make money. And so our goal wasn't, we knew we weren't going to be Joe Rogan. But we had kind of a viewpoint like, well, if we can get to where we have 100 regular listeners to every episode, we're in a decent spot. And that's what we did. We got there. We got to where we were averaging 100 to 120, 140 listeners an episode. But then we took a break for COVID. We recorded in person. And when we came back, we lost our listenership. And I changed jobs. One of our co-hosts, we at one point had added a third co-host. She had moved away. And we got to the point where, it was worth it to us because 120, 140 listeners, the amount of effort we were putting in, it was worth it. But when we were averaging 20 to 30, it's like, maybe it's not worth it anymore. So that's why we've decided we're wrapping things up. So just figure out what success looks like to you, but be realistic with it. Like, it's so hard to get noticed these days. The internet is just awash with people all trying to do the same thing as you. And you really just need to, you're going to have to be creative. Or if you're not creative, you're just going to have to just really stick with it. A lot of just perseverance will go a long way in this because there's so many people who do 2 episodes and quit. The podcasting landscape is littered with millions of 1 to 2 to 3 episode podcasts that the people just didn't have the stick-to-itiveness and they dropped it, and that was the end of that. Step 3, you need to name your podcast. Whatever your dream name is, it's probably taken. That's coming to me so many times. I really wanted to do a podcast about watching movies with giant sharks in it. And all the names I came up with, variations of them were taken, which I was surprised at how many movies there are about, or how many podcasts there are about movies about giant sharks. So, so make it descriptive and preferably clever. The more descriptive and more clever you can make it, the more likely it is people are going to remember it. And don't use your name. Joe Rogan uses his name, but guess what? He's Joe Rogan. I suspect none of us in this room are as famous as Joe Rogan. So unless you are an established brand or an established figure, you probably don't want to use your name. If you are a business that you're like, our business needs a podcast, then yeah, you're going to want to use your name for that. You're a celebrity, yes, use your name. That's your biggest draw. Go for that. But otherwise, just think of a descriptive name, ideally that's clever, because the clever it is, the easier people will remember it. If it sticks out, if it's just the book-selling podcast, that doesn't excite me, But if it's the how to sell fantasy books, okay, still not super exciting, but at least, okay, well, hey, I want to sell fantasy books. Okay, so that draws my interest a little bit more. And then maybe you name it the Book Dragon Horde or something like that. Well, okay, well now, all right, well, what do we have going on here? I'm a little more interested. So next, you need to work on your elevator pitch. This is something that's very common in books. The idea is if you get stuck, or not stuck, but you're riding an elevator to the next floor with someone that would be interested in whatever it is you're doing, you have a pitch that you can give to them in the time it takes an elevator to go from one floor to the next. You've got a literally captive audience. Here's your 2-sentence pitch on what you're about, and just work on it, and just keep working on it, and keep working on it. Just work on it till it's as clever and as descriptive as you can, and practice the delivery. You want it to be smooth and roll off the tongue. You never know when you're going to be at an event and you overhear someone, okay, they're interested in selling fantasy books. Well, I've got a podcast for that. So you go, hey, I overheard what you were saying. This might interest you, and boom, hit them with the elevator pitch. If they're not interested, go on with your life. But if they are, then you've hooked them, And so, yeah, just keep at it. It takes there's a real art to elevator pitches that I haven't mastered and very few people have, but just keep at it. You'll get there. you are going to need some sort of logo at some point before you get to the point where you're putting your podcasts out there. Once you start putting your podcasts out there, you have to have a logo. You don't have to have a logo until then, but the sooner you get a logo, the better. But as part of the uploading process, they need an image, and so you're going to need a cover. Pay someone to make it. If you don't have the skills, just pay someone. Go on to Fiverr.com, Fiverr, Fiverr. There's thousands of people on there that will make you a logo for cheap. Yes. Fiverr. I'm actually on there. You can hire me on Fiverr. Fiverr is a website that is you basically say for $5 I will do X. Yeah, it's for freelancing. Now, everything's not $5 on there. It works in increments of $5. So, for example, you can go on there right now and you can hire me. I'm on vacation on there, but for $10, I will write you 500 words of video game lore or board game lore, rules, things like that. And so, there are people on there that all they do is just making logos. There's probably someone on there that is specifically selling podcast logos. Frequently, what you're going to find is most of the more affordable ones live in maybe like Eastern Europe or Pakistan, things like that, where it's $5 has more economic buying power than here. But as a writer, I hire my editors off Fiverr. I have a delightful woman in Texas who edits all my books, and I just pay her through Fiverr, and it works. It's a great system. Highly recommend it. And so anything you need, you can go on Fiverr and hire people to edit your podcast for you. They'll do all the editing. They will make you intros, outros, you name it. Whatever you want done, if you have the money, someone will do it for you. And that's the thing. At the end of the day, you can buy your way out of any podcasting problem. But I'm designing this as though you're like me and don't have just loads of disposable income. But you can go simple. Now, the more eye-catching your podcast image is, the better. But you have to think most people are listening to podcasts on their phone, and that image is going to be a tiny blip. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be something. You got to have something. All right, step 4. You need to plan your episodes. How long are they going to be? So if you're under 20 minutes, it's considered a short podcast. 20 to 45 is considered roughly average based on an average commute of around 20 minutes. And 45 minutes longer is considered long. Like for example, my podcast was very book review based. And so we wanted to be able to go real deep in on these books or short stories, whatever we were talking about. So we knew we were going to be a longer podcast. So we tried to keep it to around an hour. But I've had others that I've done or worked on and been involved in that, they go for the micro kind of 5-minute podcast or 10-minute podcast. One of the most popular writing podcasts is called Writing Excuses. It's with Brandon Sanderson and a couple other fantasy authors, and their whole shtick is 15 minutes or less because we're not that good and you're busy. Like that's their whole thing. It's like little, easily digestible chunks, and it works for them. They're incredibly popular. So if you're kind of trying to weigh what you've got going on there, fractionally more people are put off by short episodes. Like I think it's like 17% of people hate short episodes, but only like 13% of people really want short episodes. Most part, people don't really care. But there is a slight advantage to not going short. Slight. But then the end of the day is no one is fundamentally going to care about the length if they're getting consistent value from your podcast. I hang out on the podcasting subreddits a fair bit, or I used to, and I can't count the number of times that people complained at length. Is like, ugh, they just talk about nothing for 15 minutes before we finally get into the podcast. They're like, I just skip the first 10 minutes every time, and I've never missed anything, you know? So don't cut content just to be short. If you're providing good content, keep it. But just keep in mind that unless your podcast is very personality based, they're likely not there for your personality. They may hang around because of your personality, but they don't know who you are. They weren't drawn to your podcast because of you. They were drawn to your podcast because of your idea. So just something to bear in mind. Also, look at what other podcasters are doing that are operating in this space. If you're doing a podcast on architecture, look at the other podcasts on architecture. What are they doing? What's the average length? You know, most podcatchers. A podcatcher is what you use to acquire your podcasts. So it's Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts. I use Podcast Addict. It's just an app. So that, huh? No, a host is different. We'll get to host in a second, but a host is different from a podcatcher. A host hosts your podcast, and the podcatcher is what pulls from the host. No one listens to your podcast from Libsyn. No one listens to your podcast from, well, they may use Anchor, but by and large, they're not listening to it from where you're hosting your podcast. They can, that's a possibility, but no one really does that because everyone uses different hosts. It's impractical to do it that way. You don't go to Libsyn and listen to podcasts from there because not all podcasts are on Libsyn. You go to Apple Podcasts because Apple Podcast draws from all the hosts and brings them into one space. So, I forget exactly where we started with this, but a podcatcher is different from a host. I know where we were. So the podcatchers will typically, if you click on a podcast, it'll tell you the average length of a podcast, what their average episode length is, and how frequently they upload. So take a look at that. If you're doing Montgomery Architecture Podcast, just go to your podcatcher and search Architecture Podcasts and just see what's there and look at some of the ones that are more popular, the ones top of the list that have tons of reviews. Click on that. See what their average length is. See how often they're putting out episodes. That's not to say do what they're doing. It's just if everyone in the space that you see is doing 45-minute episodes, maybe there's an opportunity there. Maybe you want to be the person providing that 20-minute episode. Maybe you're dialing in and doing a more focused, narrowly viewed podcast. Just something, do your research is basically what I'm saying. And last, you're not Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster in the world by a lot. Fear Factor, did you ever watch Fear Factor? He was the host on Fear Factor, and he then became like a ringside announcer for MMA fights. But he got into podcast. He was one of the first celebrities to get into podcasting, and he's been doing it forever, and I don't like him. He's kind of a terrible person. But that aside, he's been doing it so long and has built up, and it's routine for him to do four-hour podcasts. But you're not him. I thought more people would know who he was when I put that little line in there. But no, he can get away with a lot of stuff. You're not going to be able to get away with a 3-hour podcast, frankly. Maybe on down the road, you build up a dedicated following. Maybe you start doing bonus content on your Patreon or something like that. But by and large, I'd be leery of going over an hour, typically, unless you're really bringing some good content. Continued planning your episodes. You need to figure out how often you're going to release it. Once a month is about as slow as you can go and hope to grow your podcast. And that is not really ideal. Twice a month is better, Weekly is even better. And the reason why is because people plan their lives out weekly for the most part. People, I mean, yeah, to a degree, people are like, oh, well, what am I going to be doing 3 weeks from now? But typically, you know, they'll wake up on Monday and like, all right, what do I have to do this week? They don't think, what do I have to do this week and next week? So if your podcast is coming out every week, that can become a routine part of their life. They're like, okay, well, you know, oh, I need to go download the latest episode of this so I can listen to it on my ride to work. But that said, consistency trumps all. It is better for you to put out one episode a month consistently than to either rush out a bunch of crappy once-a-week episodes or to just people don't know when you're actually doing a podcast. You know, if people know that without fail, the last Monday of every month, your podcast is coming out, then you will acquire people that works for. They'll at least subscribe and they'll get a notification. Oh, cool, there's a new episode. You know, they might not rush out because it's not on their radar as much, but they'll get it, you know. But if they're like, you know, you do 3 months of putting out an episode and then you don't put out an episode for a couple months and then you do and then you don't, people will no longer subscribe. The people just don't have the attention span. There's too many other, you're competing against so many other people. You really need to be consistent. So if you're doing once a week, commit to once a week. If you're doing twice a week, commit to it, you know. If you can't commit to once a week, try to commit to twice a week or you know, twice a month. When we started, we were doing 2 episodes a week. And we kept that up for a while. But when we realized that we just didn't have the time that we did, we dropped to 1 episode a week. But we stayed consistent with that. You know, we let everyone know, like, hey, you know, we were doing Mondays and Wednesdays. Now we're just doing Wednesdays. And then coming back from COVID, we let people know, it was like, hey, just the way of the world, we're doing once a month. But we tried to be consistent with that. The other thing you can consider is doing a season. As long as you tell people that yours is a seasonal podcast, you know, then you don't have to be consistent long term. Maybe, you know, hey, we're doing a seasonal podcast. It's going to be 10 episodes, and then we're going to take a break. And people work with that. They know that it's a fixed amount of time. And as long as you're letting them know, hey, we're definitely doing a season 2, they'll stay subscribed. If they liked it, they'll stay subscribed, waiting for you to come out with season 2, especially if you can give them little updates throughout. It's perfectly acceptable to do an episode that's 3 minutes long, just saying, hey, you know, we're in the middle of our break, but, you know, we're still coming back October of, you know, this year. Boom. Seasons tend to be more typical in like audio dramas or like documentary style. Like if you think Serial's a real popular podcast, you know, it typically goes for, we're doing a deep dive on this, and then we're going to take a break while we go do research on the other thing. And then we're going to come back and do another deep dive, 10 episodes, 12 episodes, whatever it is. Things like that. And they're typically themed. You don't really see seasonal podcasts where it's, hey, it's me and my guy here talking about movies. This is a season. No, what you'll see is, hey, it's me and my guy. This season, we're only talking about giant alligators in movies. This is our season. Next season, we're doing giant rodents. You know, so you'll see themed seasons like that, but you typically don't see seasons that are just random chatter. You need to figure out what your format's going to be, how many co-hosts, if you're going to have co-hosts. Are you going to be a solo podcast? Are you going to have co-hosts? Is it going to be interview style? There are pros and cons to each. If it's a solo podcast, it's the easiest to maintain consistency because there is no one to hold you up. You don't have to wait on, oh, we got to get our schedules right, or, oh, this guy's out sick. It's just you. Co-hosted is easier to maintain people's interest. And you get a little less mic fright, especially if you're new to this. It's good to have someone to play off of so you don't sit there and have dead air. I have done both. I have done 2 solo podcasts, and they were music-based podcasts, and the one with co-hosts. And co-hosting was easier. It just was. Now, I will say that it was a lot easier do all the planning and the back end kind of stuff as a solo, but the actual maintaining interesting content, it was easier co-hosted. Interview style is arguably the most complex because now it's not just arranging the schedule between you and one other person. Now it's you and a different person each week or each month. And that can get very complicated. The big perk to that is, in theory, the people that you're interviewing have connections of their own, and you're cross-promoting. I'm considering starting a podcast based around interviewing urban fantasy authors. And so the perk to that is these are all authors that have their own social media presence, so, and they have an incentive to share this information. So that's worth its weight in gold, to have people that are out there actively promoting your podcast. That's great. The hang up is it's much more difficult to coordinate. So you got to think. Are you going to script this podcast? If you're doing a solo podcast, most of them are scripted. If you've ever listened to Lore, that's a scripted podcast. It's incredibly popular. But God, where does that guy find the time? Well, I'll tell you where he finds the time now. He got good enough. He does it for a living. But when he was starting, to me, it was, how did he find the time to put out so many episodes that were fully scripted, long episodes that were fully scripted? Audio dramas are also going to be scripted. Outside of that, you typically don't want to be a scripted podcast. It just sounds awkward. Especially if you have co-hosts, there's no reason why you should be scripted. If there are mistakes, you just edit them out. You don't write a script. How we did it was we just came up with bullet points of what we wanted to talk about so we wouldn't forget something. I came up with a script each episode, but it was make sure to mention this news, make sure to mention this news, this is what we're talking about, make sure you mention this, but I wasn't, make sure that Derek says this, make sure that Bob says this, So now we get to the meat of it. Here's how you actually make the podcast. You have to record an episode. There's two things. It takes hardware and software. So at a minimum, you have to have a microphone and you have to have a device with internet access that can record. Technically, you can use your phone. Don't. Just don't. The microphone on your phone is not good enough. Just flat out. It's just not. Unless you're flat broke, don't use your phone. If that's what it takes to get you started and that's all you have money for, okay, you can do it. There are people that do YouTube channels with just their phone. I routinely put out YouTube videos just using my phone. But for a podcast, the better audio quality, the more successful you're going to be. I'll tell you from personal experience, if you've got the money, don't go as cheap as you can. When I got started, broke college kid, I got a USB snowball microphone. It was $50. And it was fine. It was fine. But the hang up came that, I want to add a co-host. Well, because I went cheap, that type of microphone, you can't have two of them plugged into a computer at the same time. They're so cheap that the computer won't recognize as two different microphones. So we ended up, it's like all the money that I spent getting us initially started, if I had just gone in and gotten some decent gear, I would have saved a fair bit of money in the long run. And people really can tell the difference. I toyed with the idea of letting you listen to an early episode to a later episode so you can hear the marked difference. But I didn't. Felt like it was going to be too complicated with a system I've never used before. So maybe later times of this. Mike, I'd caution you, unless money is really tight, don't go cheap. The caveat there is if you don't think you're going to stick with this and you really just want to try it out, then maybe you do. Maybe you go a little cheap just to see if you're going to stick with it. But really, you got to make as good of an impression your first few episodes as you can to hook people. So there are devices that can be used to record with built-in microphones, like portable recorders, like you see here. This is my new baby. This is only my second time ever using it, and I'm probably messing it up. But you're still, though, at the end of the day, you're going to have some way to get it from here onto the internet, which is you're typically going to want a computer. You can use your phone, but this is so difficult. If you have access to a computer, I see a variety of laptops here. I don't know why you wouldn't just use your laptop, especially because you're probably going to be doing some editing on this file after you've recorded it. And for that, you're definitely going to need a computer. So there are a wide array of easy-to-use USB microphones. So I'm going to walk over here. This is the exact same microphone, but you can plug it in to a USB drive. Just boop, goes right in. Conversely, so in the back, that's a USB plug there, but it also has this audio cable. It's a lot, right? Yep. So, if you're just keeping it simple, if it's just you by yourself, recording into your laptop, you're just going to use USB. Quick, easy, simple. It'll make it a lot easier for your software when it comes to that. But I see there's 3 of y'all. I don't know if y'all are planning to do a podcast together with 3 hosts. That's when things get a little trickier. That's the problem that we ran into. Our podcast ran for 40 episodes with just the 2 of us, and then we added a 3rd co-host. And that's when we realized that none of our software would work with 3 microphones. And USB, the software will happily work with 3 microphones. It just won't with USB. Most software like that is limited on how many USB ports it'll recognize. So what you have to do is get an interface. I was going to bring mine, but I have built a contraption around mine, and with the weather, I didn't want to have to run to the car carrying this contraption. So, but there's a wide variety of them. Rode, RODE, is very popular. Ours is an Audio Technica, I believe. I can't quite remember now. But these all take channels. Basically, what an interface does, however many channels it has, it takes all those channels, puts it into one stream to go into your computer. And so then your software is like, oh, well, I only have to recognize one port. But this interface is almost like a small computer. It's taking all these streams of audio information, putting them into one stream. But when it gets to your software, it can then recognize, okay, hey, this is microphone 1, this is microphone 2, this is microphone 3. And they come, you can get, I had a DigiDesign 03 Rack Plus when I was in grad school, which was an 8-channel interface but it wasn't necessarily designed for podcasting. They make 16-channel interfaces. I can't fathom an instance where you would need 16 channels to record a podcast. So typically a 4-channel would probably be good. Or, if you're doing something like a really complicated, like live play D&D one, you may need an 8-channel so that you can get to, 5 or 6 people. But for the most part, we got a 3-channel one. We got a decent one. It cost us about $300 at the time. And it was 4-channel. We bought a kit that came with some microphones, the interface, some cables, and we were good to go. You will get better audio quality through the audio cable than through the USB cable, but not enough that people will probably notice. But we just plugged in 3 microphones into our interface, plugged our interface into our laptop, and we were good to go. And that was the hardware. Questions? Because that was slightly more complicated than the stuff I've said before. Nope.
So do you have to be in the same location as your program?
No, you don't. You don't. I think I think I cover that, but I'll go ahead and talk about that. If we get to it, I'll just skip it. So with our podcast, we recorded in person because I'm very unlucky with technology. It's chronic, the issues I have with technology. And we tried to record remotely and just kept having technical issues. But there are millions of podcasts that record remotely that their hosts have never even met each other. They only record digitally. They use Zoom or they use Discord in conjunction with something like OBS, things like that. If you're doing that, what you need to do is both sides need to record the audio, or however many hosts you have. If there are 4 hosts, all 4 hosts need to record. You don't have to, but what you run into if only one person records it, what you wind up is the person who's recording it, they sound crisp and clear because they're speaking through their microphone, but everyone that they're recording via Zoom you can tell that they've been recorded through Zoom. But if everyone records their own file and then just one person takes them and throws them together, then everyone is coming clearly through a microphone. Now that said, there's hundreds of thousands of podcasts that only ever just record via Zoom, just one person records it, and it's fine. If that's the thing, people will be forgiving if your content is good enough. But if your audio quality is too bad, they will drop it. I mean, just quickly. People aren't the most patient when it comes to audio quality, unless you're bringing just phenomenal content, So just something to be aware of. So yes, you can definitely record not in person. That's what I'm going to attempt to do with my new podcast, and I'm dreading it already. But it is just as viable as recording in person, especially these days of COVID. I mean, recording online just makes more sense than ever. So you've got your hardware, whether it just be like, so if you're recording online, you just need a microphone and your computer. You don't have to worry with an interface or anything like that. But everyone's got to have software. There's some, like if you have a Mac, GarageBand, a lot of people record in GarageBand, and it's free, or it was. I assume it's still free with Macs. There are pro level software like Pro Tools that you can pay for, or you can get a program like Audacity, which is what I use, and it's free. And I will show you right now. This is I have Audacity open. This is Audacity. This is one of our episodes. Now this is this is a finished episode. This is after we've gone in and added in our intro and outro and everything. But yeah, so you just need some software like this. It's this is the actual audio sound file. You see those pitches, you see those little spikes. That's probably where my co-host coughed or laughed or bumped the table, or I did. And so you need software like this, even if you're not going to edit the content of your podcast. There are people that will go in and edit out every every ah. God, I cannot imagine how tedious that is. We just went with it. Our podcast was very much one take. We recorded, if we muffed the first 2 or 3 minutes, then maybe we might start over. But by and large, we recorded. You see this episode is shy of 50 minutes. And that was just us. We sat down and we talked. But you are going to need to edit in your intro and outro, assuming you have them, which if you don't, you're messing up. So at the very minimum, you're going to do that. What we did as well was while I'm not going to go in and edit every and ah, I will adjust the overall volume of the podcast. Our recording software, or no, our recording system, for reasons I was never able to figure out, recorded oddly quietly. So every episode, I had to come in and crank up the volume on it so that it could be heard. Never figured it out. And so that is something that you can do. Just it's very easy to do. Whatever software you use, there's tons of guides out there. There's YouTube videos. And as long as you're just doing simple stuff, it doesn't take long at all. You can be a novice. All you're doing is you just grab your file, open it with your program. It'll be in a track. Or if you're using an interface, or you're recording via USB mic, you'll be using this software to actually do the recording. You'll just plug in your microphones, ready to go, and just hit record. And you'll see the audio tracks generating. And each microphone will be on its own channel. So if you have one person that is real quiet, you can go in and crank them up to where they're as loud as everyone else. But if you're using something like this self-contained digital recorder here, it's all going to be in one file. And you will just plug in. When we're done here, I'll take this, USB it into my laptop, pull the file off, load it into Audacity, and then edit the volume, hopefully. We'll see. For all I know, it's not been recording this whole time. And then you just boom, put on your intro, your outro, make sure the volume sounds level, do some spot checks on it, and then boom, export it typically as an MP3. You can export it as a WAV file. WAV files sound better, but they're a lot bigger. So it's going to depend on your host, and we'll get to that in a second. But if your host doesn't limit your file size, go WAV. But if your host limits how much you're allowed to upload in a month, you're going to go MP3. And for the most part, it's not really going to matter. A lot of folks are going to be listening to it on little earbuds anyway, and those are crappy speakers for the most part. Or they're going to listen to it in their car that's got a blown out tweeter, and it'll be fine. Okay, where were we? We were on software. Okay, any questions there on software? I recommend Audacity. It's free and easy to use, and it has a ton of guides. It's open source software, so people support it. If you've got more money, you can go Pro Tools, especially if you're going to use an interface. You can buy a Pro Tools interface and go that whole route, but really, just get a good Rode interface and just use Audacity. Yes?
Is that something like in the Creative Cloud Suite or something?
What, Pro Tools? It is now. Last time I used it, you can get a free version of it that's really tricky to use, and I think intentionally so. And that's what we used for a little while. I was using the free version of Pro Tools, but you can only have 3 save files at a time. So we were having to generate it, go, and then delete so we could do the next one, and it was just a nightmare. But last time I used a paid version, it came with a dongle that you'd plug into your USB drive because Pro Tools is hyper paranoid about piracy.
I was thinking if you have access to Adobe, you might have access to Audition.
Oh,
Yeah, Audition.
yeah, people, yeah, I have a violent hatred to software as a service like that.
They all have access to it?
Yeah. So if you have access to something like that, it's great. I just refuse to pay for software that I don't really own. That's why I highly recommend anyone who's tired of dealing with Photoshop. Audacity is a company that's put out 3 programs to replicate Publisher, Photoshop. And they routinely go on sale. You can get them for $25 each, and they're great. I designed this logo in Audacity, or not Audacity, in Affinity. It's great, and you buy it once, and you own it. Ugh. Yeah. Oh yeah. It routinely updates. So here's the little sundries: outro, intro. You need one. No, you cannot use that song that you heard on the radio for your intro and outro unless you're going to pay for it. There are a ton of websites out there. I'm not going to list them. You can find them that has free music. Sometimes it's free and you have to credit. But there are some that is just free. People will just make little 15 or 30 or second or maybe a minute long little bits of music and upload it, and you can use it in your podcast for free. It's nice to credit them, but if the site doesn't require it, it's not required. And a lot of them will do like the same bit of music in 15, 30, and minute long increments. And so on your intro, you just need to give a brief introduction, like introduce who the hosts are, maybe give your elevator pitch, something like that. But it just saves you time. If you have that intro ready to go, like ours was, I think it's Welcome to the Book Spirits Booze podcast, where we have books, drink booze, and have beards or something like that. And then that was one host said that, and then I was like, I'm Bob of Tells by Bob. Tanya said, I'm Tanya, I forget. And then our last guy said, I'm Derek, the ass of the podcast. Like, boom, 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 boom. So you got to hear each person's voice. You got to hear their name. So that way you're not spending a lot of time at the beginning of every episode introducing yourself. You just, boom, it's in your intro. It's probably like a 15-second clip of music with a little bit of words over it. And then you can just drop it in at the beginning of your episode when you go to editing. Just do it every time. It's great. Your outro is a great place to, put that, hey, your plea for give us a like, give us a review. This is our Patreon. Email us your questions at. And then that way, if you have that already recorded and ready to go, you won't forget it at the end of the episode. You can just drop it in, and you know that all the really important information is always going to be there. You need to learn how to talk into a microphone. You just need to practice. You don't want to be too close. You don't want to be too far. And I highly recommend getting a pop filter. That is that screen that you see on that microphone there. This is a pop filter. This is what will mute your fricatives and plosives, so like your strong noises, it will cut down on that. And just generally, it cleans up your audio a little bit. This fuzzy thing is a windscreen / it acts as a pop filter for a portable device like this. But yeah, before you record your first episode, I would just get everyone sit down and just practice speaking into the mic, especially if you're interfaced into your software, so that you can actually see those audio waves generating as you speak. So you can see, like, oh man, I'm too close. My sound waves are this, and her sound waves are this, and her sound waves are this. Like I'm too close. What if I sit back? And that's why that's what's called a boom mic stand there, the tall one that looks like my arm here. That's really good because what I have found is getting someone to sit in the same place in the same way, and then they just know, like, hey, I can lean back in my chair, and as long as I stay leaned back in my chair, the boom mic is moved around to right here. As long as I'm leaned back in my chair, I'm at the perfect height. So yeah, that's what I recommend for the actual recording process. So now you got to choose your host. Your host takes your files and generates an RSS feed. That's how a podcast works. Podcatchers read your RSS feed. People take the podcatcher, click download or click stream, and that's how the podcast comes to be. Fundamentally, all a host is doing is generating an RSS feed. There are very complicated ways for you to do this on your own. You don't want to do it, just use a host. And I've got a few kind of recommendations here. You can use YouTube. It's free. Especially if you're doing a video-based podcast, you can do it that way. The downside is YouTube doesn't generate the RSS feed like that, and it's not going to go into podcatchers. But if let's say you have a gaming YouTube channel, maybe you're wanting to do a video kind of podcast style, it's viable. I don't recommend it, but you can do it that way. It's free. Anchor is an incredibly popular app right now. It's because it's free and it has built-in recording software. I have not used it. Cannot vouch for anything to do with it, but it is popular. They also apparently do a decent job of pairing you with advertisers once you get to a certain point. Pinecast, I have used. You can try it for free. You can have up to 10 episodes on there for free. If you want to pay, it's $10 a month. There's no limit on the number of episodes or, and this is what's really cool about Pinecast, the number of shows. A lot of hosts will limit you to one show per plan. So, for example, Libsyn. The solo podcasts I did on Pinecast. My big baby podcast I did on Libsyn because I did a lot of research, and at the time, it was the oldest, the biggest, great analytics, great support, yada, yada, yada. It came highly recommended. It's not as recommended now. It's a little pricey, and they charge you based on the amount that you upload. So, for example, for us, it was, I believe, $20 a month, and we could only upload 450 megabytes of episodes a month, and that's around 4.5 hours, very rough, of MP3 wave. Oh, hang it up. But MP3, that's probably for us. It was fine because we were doing 4 episodes a month, around an hour. It was fine. But for them, you have to pay. You have to have higher level plans to get access to the statistics. So I don't heavily recommend it unless if you're just really not tech savvy at all. They've got really good support, but I'd be loath to recommend them now. There are a ton of them out there, though. I just put a random list of some of the more popular ones: Buzzsprout, Captivate, Transistor, Castos, RSS.com, Podbean, Simplecast, blah, 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 blah. There's a ton of them out there. Really, just do a search for best podcast host, and there'll be a ton of articles there that really break down the nuts and bolts of, hey, we recommend this one because of this. I know a lot of people really recommend Buzzsprout. A lot of people really recommend Podbean. The rest of those, less recommended. All right, so then you release it. You've got it recorded. You've chosen your host. You've got this audio file. You upload it to your host. And then boom, that's it. They've generated the RSS feed, and a lot of podcatchers will immediately start to pick it up. It'll take a few hours probably for it to show up, but there's a lot of podcatchers that just basically sit there pulling everything off Libsyn all the time. Boom. Then you just share, let people know, hey, episode 1, it's out. Boom. But that's not all there is to it. So, like I said, a lot of podcatchers do just sit there and pull everything from a place, but a lot don't. So, like Apple Podcasts, which at one point was by far the biggest podcatcher of them all, will not just pull RSS feeds. You have to submit your podcast to iTunes. Or Apple Podcasts now. They changed the name. Like there are a ton out there that will not pick up your podcast. You have to submit them. Now, once you submit them, they will then pick it up and they'll pull it forever. It's just one and done. But you just need to look up a list of places to submit my podcast. And there's tons of these out there. They have a link. You just click that link. It'll take you right to their submission page. You fill it out. Boom, boom, boom. Just take an hour or two and fill out as many of those as you can. Because at that point, you've hit all the major podcatchers, and there's not a lot of point to just sitting there finding, that one podcatcher that has 20 listeners. You want to hit the big ones. And that's what we did. We just sat there and just added. And a a lot of your better hosts will track. They'll tell you, hey, you had this many downloads from Apple Podcasts. You had this many downloads from Google Podcasts. You had this many from Spotify. Spotify claims they are currently the biggest podcast site. They've taken the throne from Apple. They probably have. Lord knows they've spent enough money at it. If they hadn't, I'd be real disappointed. And they actually, they've now got a ton of exclusive podcasts. Joe Rogan went to them, yada, yada, yada. So make sure that you are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Those are probably about the 3 biggest. So make sure you're on there and then just start working your way out. Now you need to promote it. You go to these social media, ideally where your target market is hanging out. You will probably need a website if you're going to take this real seriously. I don't recommend doing a website right out the gate because you just need to know if it's going to be worth your time. But if you're going to stick with it, you're going to need a website as just where you're going to send people. You want people to be able to stream your podcast through your website. That's where your merchandise is going to go. If you're doing blogs to update news, things like that, that'll be there. Links to your Patreon, contact forms, just one repository. Start building an email list. No, really, start building an email list. If I could change anything about my creative life is 10 years ago, I would have started building my email list. And I kick myself every day when I wake up that I didn't do that. Here's the reason why. Facebook. If you have a Facebook page, if you've had one for 10 years, let's say, you probably will notice that it gets a fraction of the traffic that it once did because Facebook no longer likes pages. Facebook likes groups. So if you have a Facebook page and not a group, you're messing up because Facebook changed the way the algorithm works. A post in a page versus a post in a group, the one in the group is 3 times more likely to be seen than one on a page. If there's 3,000 people here on the page and only 200 people here in the group, probably 10 people are going to see it here and probably 30 people are going to see it here. That's just, and they can change the rules at any time because it's their platform. And they will. They are constantly changing the rules. You never know when Instagram is going to suddenly just ban all content of a certain type. And if you are operating in that field, you're screwed. Look at Tumblr. Tumblr used to have a very bustling art for hire community, especially like adult content kind of deal. Well, Tumblr changed the rules. They no longer allowed adult content on there, and a ton of people who only advertised their business through Tumblr were really hurting because they couldn't do it anymore. You never know when the rules are going to change. The only place where you have control of the rules is your website and your email list. And email list is free. You take it with you wherever you go. You never lose it, hopefully. And it's yours. And that is the best way to reach people that are interested in your stuff. They have signed up for your email list. At one point, they were at least mildly interested in what you had going on. They may eventually remove themselves from your list, or they may stay on it forever and click everything you ever send to them. But you have control. Start an email list. And then I would recommend making trailers, little trailers. Your first upload will be a trailer, typically, to your host. Just maybe it's a minute long, just introducing what you're about. But I would make little trailers of 15, 30, and 1 minute, in length, and swap them. See if you can find other podcasts operating in the same area and swap. Hey, I'll put your 15-minute blurb on at the end of my episode if you'll do the same for me. And so that we get cross-promotion going. Monetize it. You probably won't make any money doing this, but it's not unreasonable to expect that you could make back your costs if you do it right. At one point, our Patreon was paying our hosting fees, and that's what our goal was. We didn't have a big Patreon, but we were making enough off our Patreon that our hosting fees didn't come out of our pocket. It came out of our Patreon fund, basically. And we were happy with that, You won't probably make enough money to pay you back for your time, But it's not unreasonable to think that over time you will earn back the money you paid on your hardware, maybe the software if you paid for it, and your hosting fees. If you do, it's probably going to come from either selling ad space, which is tricky, or having a Patreon. I recommend that every podcast have a Patreon. Statistically, less than 3% of your regular listeners will ever consider backing your Patreon, but if you get to where you have 10,000 listeners, 3% of that's a sizable number, and if each one's only giving you $1 a month, it adds up. Some of your hosts will help you sell ad space. Libsyn, for example, they will happily help you get advertisers, but for Libsyn, it was you had to average 10,000 downloads an episode. So at that point, they would find you advertisers and coordinate all that. What we did was on our Patreon, we had a advertiser tier. You could, for $20 a month, we would put an ad on each of our episodes for you, and that's how we paid the bulk of our stuff. So you can do things like that. If you are doing a board game podcast here in Montgomery, you might go to Visions and be like, hey, would you sponsor our podcast? We'll put an ad in every episode. We just want $50 a month or $10 an episode, something like that. You can negotiate, and you'll probably, depending on the nature of your podcast, you might have decent luck doing that. Best practices, be consistent. Always be consistent. Jesus, just be consistent. Build a buffer, especially when you're getting started. Especially if you're gonna release every week, try and have 2 or 3 episodes just sitting there, so that we got COVID. We're not gonna record this week. You can drop in an episode and not miss a beat. There are a number of subreddits. I don't know if any of y'all read it. Reddit's a great resource. It's a cesspool as well, so go with caution. But there's a couple of subreddits that are all about podcasting. There's even one, it's called Podcast Guest Exchange, where you can post that, hey, I'm looking for guests of this type, or hey, I'm willing to be a guest of this type. Things like that. There's a ton of great information on there, and the best part is there's an active conversation going on about trends in the industry. So it's on there that you're going to find out that, oh, okay, hey, we think Anchor is going to go under. Okay, well, if you're on Anchor, then you may need to start looking to change hosts, things like that. And there are podcasts that you can listen to about starting a podcast. They're going to do this much better than I did, if you just really want to. And there's actually a real good one called The Feed from Libsyn. It's less about starting a podcast, but more about like trends in podcasting. And you don't have to be a Libsyn, user to listen to that. I've learned a lot of good stuff there. All right. Like I said, the PowerPoint and the Word document version of this PowerPoint are going to be, you'll be able to get printable versions off our website, off our free downloads page.